I have to say that this is put together rather quickly as well.
Thanks.
Dave actually rang me up a couple of days ago and asked if I could come in and give a paper. My immediate reaction was no possibility at all, because I haven't got anything. But then I realised, like most of us, I have this kind of chest of academic ephemera that can draw in a piece of unfinished business. And with 3 fragments that I decided I wanted to reanimate and stitch together. So this is very much a stitched together paper. It's nomadic in that sense, just like I am, obviously, having taught in all these places and got kicked out of order. The first was an interest in the concept of repetition. 19th century with Marx, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Freud on the cusp, through to Heidegger and Deleuze and a few other people in the 20th century. The second was a conversation that I've been wanting to set up for some time between Gilles Deleuze and Emmanuel Levinas, which is in very early stages and is very complicated. There are certain elements, I mean they're very different, but there are elements that they perhaps have in common. Certainly, indirectly in Levinas's case, in response to Bergson, notions of faciality and various other elements like that. And the third was some work I was doing on cinematic horror some time ago, which kind of got dropped off. And I put them together, and the one on cinematic horror, the last one, I did actually give a paper on some time ago. The only person I think who's present for that was Anna. And I have actually lifted a couple of paragraphs from that, so you may possibly recognise them. But as Hume said, repetition changes nothing in the object repeated, but does change something in the mind which contemplates it. So that's my excuse for that, all right? Okay, and I'm going to begin with a couple of epigraphs, and it is lots of bits and pieces, and it is about the disparate. So, it's working with the disparate. So there's a kind of meta level of performativity going on here between you and me, I hope. The first quotation. The rustling of the there is horror. To be conscious is to be torn away from the there is, since the existence of consciousness constitutes a subjectivity. A subject of existence that is, to some extent, a master of being, already a name in the anonymity of night. Horror is somehow a movement which will strip consciousness of its very subjectivity. That's from Emmanuel Levinas from 1946. There is existence without existence. And the second one, I wonder if anyone will recognise where this comes from. We live on a placid island of ignorance, in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Do you recognise that? It's H.P. Lovecraft, who Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari do refer to in a chapter on Becoming Intense, which I'll return to in due course. It's from the Call of the Cthulhu. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. That's the opening section. Right. Now to move on to something completely different. In his seminal study of Spinoza's materialism and political philosophy, written whilst he was incarcerated in a series of Italian prisons in the late 1970s, Antonio Negri notes a systematic shift in the ambience of the scholar's library in 17th century Holland. For although Spinoza's library is that of a cultured merchant, rather than a specialised academic resource, it is notable in that while it has elements of a Renaissance library, in that it exists for consultation and stimulation, it is not a library of the crisis of the Renaissance. It is not a Baroque library. In contrast, Negri points out, the desk of an intellectual from the early part of the century was completely different. Here, there are no magicians, no mnemonic devices. Now, the allusion here to the world of the Baroque is telling for a number of reasons. For Negri, it evokes a history of the modern in which Spinoza is founder of modern materialism itself, as well as the discoverer of an alternative metaphysical material tradition running from the Renaissance magus, Neoplatonist and demonologist Marsilio Ficino to the so-called death of philosophy in our own more recent cultural history. That Ficino should be the starting point for this alternative tradition is significant, for it indicates one of several ways in which the daemonic is enfolded within the history of an occult materialism, as much as in more obviously idealist thought and suggests ways also in which both the materialism and idealism of film, this is why I'm focusing on cinema, remain infected by certain demonic strains, which constantly rematerialise within and arguably between its frames, from its origins in the Paris of the 1890s to the present. Secondly, and veering away from Spinoza himself, Negri's comment, now some 25 years old, I suppose, carries with it a certain irony, in that the image of the scholar is surrounded by books and other media in which the occult is prominent, no longer belongs to a distant past, but is very much a part of the 21st century intellectual present. An aspect of the crisis of modernity which, whatever we choose to call it, undoubtedly has resonances with the trauma of the Baroque. And central to this crisis, as I've argued elsewhere with Gary Banham, which is why that was mentioned in my thing, is a repetition of the demonic which, in common with Freud's notorious return of the repressed, doesn't merely fade into oblivion when banished by a new dominant epistemological regime, but reappears in new forms, most notably through the specifically here, repetitions associated with the moving image. Now, this is not to reduce the demonic or the diabolical to a mere metaphor or system of metaphors, but rather to elevate the fuzzy and complex outlines of this concept to the extent that it can be seen as the central dynamic in what Frederick Jameson, in a rather different context, has described as the history of forms, the way in which different cultural dominants move through the ages. It is, in this sense, an imperative from the future, derived from science, from technology, from art, that, in the words of Deleuze, determines their path in advance, but in reverse, as though intagliated. Intagliated is a great word. It sounds like something you should eat, doesn't it? Right, that cinema and its prehistory have always been implicated in a certain diabolical trajectory is evident to any reasonably astute historian of the medium. David Robinson, for example, traces the origin of cinema through the history of projection and evokes a Venetian academic named Giovanni Fontana, who in 1420 proposed the mischievous notion of painting demonic shapes on the horn window of an ordinary lantern in order to frighten people with the grotesque shadows thereby cast upon the wall. Robinson continues, without a condenser to concentrate the lamplight or a lens to focus the image, however, Giovanni's shadows must have been fairly vague. Almost 2.5 centuries passed before the lantern acquired the magic of precise representation. And while it might be possible to argue the case for such projections into prehistory, into the realm of flickering shamanistic figures on the walls of rocks and caves, for example, what is striking about Robinson's choice of Fontana is that here, at the very beginning of the specifically modern cinematic demon, we are already in the presence of a duality of representation, which, while it may have something to do with technological resources, is by no means constrained by their evolution. On the one hand, there is the vivid diabolical figure whose appearance may vary from the slightly absurd, as in the Goat of Mendes and The Devil Rides Out. I don't know if anyone's seen that film this week. To the more explicitly theatrical representations, such as may be found, for example, in the early productions of Méliès, in the silent classic Haxan and Evil Dead, or Hellraiser movies. On the other hand, there is the vague, unseen, or unrepresentable demonic, what we might call the diabolical sublime, which may merge with a feeling of generalised unease or uncanniness, or merely gesture towards evil or the satanic, as in films ranging from Robert Wise's classic adaptation of Jackson's The Haunting to the mock documentary style of The Blair Witch Project and its many imitators, perhaps to the more operatic investigations into cabals and conspiracies in Polanski's Ninth Gate or earlier Rosemary's Baby. Now, such divisions are by no means clear-cut, and of course many ostensibly demonic movies traverse easy definition at every turn, switching often quite clumsily between the chill of suggestion and the gross out of special effects and cosmetic diabolism in the cause of pure sensation. The unfortunate appearance of the devil in the otherwise excellent M.R. James adaptation Night of the Demon is a case in point. But this is only to be expected, for as Luther Link has made clear in his classic study of representations of the devil in medieval Europe, this figure, the most high amongst demons, was always a mask without a face. In other words, he or she, or it, is a series of interventions into phenomenal realities, always mutable and inconsistent, always dependent upon an external code or series of codes for identification on the part of the viewer. Or, to put it in Deleuze-Guattarian terms, the devil is always disparate and always anomalous. Now this is the bit where I move on to Deleuze and the demonic elements in Deleuze. I'm just going to revisit Levinas for a second here. From the same essay, he writes, he's writing about the fear that we sense of things in the darkness, the way in which a pile of clothes on a bed can suddenly reanimate in our imagination. The things of the day world do not, in the night, become the source of the horror of darkness, because our look cannot catch them in their foreseeable plots. On the contrary, darkness does not modify their contours for vision. It reduces them to undetermined, anonymous being, which sweats in them. This idea of an undetermined, anonymous being which sweats in these things is absolutely amazing. But this, of course, is Levinas, and this is being, it's not becoming. So there is a difference here. But there is also an element of, I suppose, the undifferentiated singularity that we find in Deleuze's appropriation of Peirce's firstness, I think, emerging in the darkness there. And then the other intervention, the rustling of there is. The rustling of there is horror. To be conscious is to be torn away from the there is, since the existence of consciousness constitutes a subjectivity, a subject of existence, that is, to some extent, a master of being, already a name in the anonymity of night. Horror is somehow a movement which will strip consciousness of its very subjectivity. Of course, being a phenomenologist, he's very concerned with that at this stage. There is another kind of there is in Deleuze, or perhaps another series, in a chapter of difference and repetition entitled Repetition for Itself, which many of you here will be familiar with, concerned more with indeterminate emanation than that given by the perspiration of being. Here, mulling over the problems of resemblance, difference, and identity, GD focuses on communication, what makes it possible. And this was actually mentioned by Lou in passing, I think. The agent of communication, as so often in Deleuze, is invoked as a kind of conceptual persona. He asked this question. This is about thunderbolts again. What is this agent, this force, which ensures communication? Thunderbolts explode between different intensities, but they are preceded by an invisible, imperceptible, dark precursor, which determines their path in advance, but in reverse, as though intagliated. Is that intagliated? In the sense of déjà vu? Sure, I said that before. Also, Bergman says something about déjà vu, it's in memory of the present. That links up with Deleuze. So who is this dark precursor then? This mask without a face who precedes and ensures communication? And this is the question perhaps I'm posing. Who is the dark precursor? Deleuze continues, well, there is no doubt that there is an identity belonging to the precursor, and a resemblance between the series which it causes to communicate. This there is, however, remains perfectly indeterminate. And Deleuze continues, we call this dark precursor, this difference in itself, which relates heterogeneous systems, the disparate. The disparate. We're moving into the area in which the emphasis is on alliances and rather than filiation here, which is a very Deleuzean and Guattarian thing. Anybody who's spent much time with Deleuze and Guattari will be aware of the profligacy of naming that goes on between their books and even between paragraphs often. So it's very, what are we doing here? Are we attaching names to concepts, or are they creating names from the concepts? Are the concepts shifting? Do the concepts have identity? Is there identity in the difference drawn out through repetition? It's one of the most fascinating things about reading Deleuze and Guattari for me. But it's in that nomenophilia, what's that word? It's one of those Greek and Latin things, clashes, isn't it? In that nomenophilia, readers are alerted to the very problems that they address in naming. So in seeking an identity in repetition between this passage and a more cited chapter in Mille Plateau on becoming intense, specifically from Memories of a Sorcerer, we're faced with the meta problem of finding connections or making connections between disparate problems within the Deleuze-Guattarian field. How, for example, does this dark precursor repeat itself in and through the figure of the demon? Following from Memories of a Sorcerer. This is about packs, tribes, swarms, that whole section about animal becoming intense. There may be no such thing as a lone wolf, but there is a leader of the pack, a master of the pack. There is the loner, and there is the demon. There is always a pact with the demon. The demon sometimes appears as the head of the band, sometimes as the loner on the sidelines, and sometimes as the higher power of the band. And here it continues with a reference to the anomalous and the liminal. I mean, it could be argued that we're all sick to death of the liminal. The liminal has been done to death, really, isn't it? Borders and all that kind of thing, but never mind, it was quite new then. Sorcerers have always held an anomalous position at the edge of the field or woods. They haunt the fringes. They are at the borderline of the village or between villages. The important thing is their affinity with the alliance, with the pact, which gives them a status opposed to that affiliation. The relation with the anomalous is one of alliance with the demons as the power of the anomalous. I'm suggesting there's a continuity between this, as a conceptual persona, between this dark precursor and this demon. And I think this alliance, this continuity, moves on a little bit later in Deleuze's books on film. Well, a lot of theorization about early film, the kind of thing that Deleuze writes about in The Movement Image, talks, for example, about primitive cinema in Noel Birch's terminology, Tom Gunning, Eisenstein, the cinema of attractions. And there is a very powerful so-called dialectic in early cinema between the ability of cinema to create illusions, the fantastic on the one hand, and the ability of cinema to represent the real, the empirical, the material on the other, with all the philosophical problems involved in that, obviously. But the myths have come down to us of people running out of cinemas because trains were charging towards them, and so on and so forth. So there's a notion that film, in some sense, is an unproblematic reproduction of a stable external reality. And this coincides, this vision of the real coincides to some extent with what Deleuze has identified as the movement image in classical cinema, which expresses or describes time as being like a spatial dimension, and yet forms assemblages in the flow of time, which we perceive by virtue of our nature as movement images. Also in the flow of time, the plane of immanence as well. Now the time image, which according to Deleuze begins to evolve after the Second World War, on the other hand, in its direct form, is not a movement, but a challenge to the very possibility of movement, and a challenge to our conception of time as movement. The time image Deleuze associates with post-war cinema, but it is also a conceptual assemblage which allows him to indicate its concern with the relation between art, philosophy, and everyday life. And his notion of the outside in relation to those concerns. The outside here being a term he borrows, and is usually the case with Deleuze, adapts to his own ends from Blanchot. Now, Deleuze's apparent desire to suggest that cinema prior to the Second War was concerned with the movement image, whilst the post-World War II was concerned with the time image, doesn't necessarily result in a particularly satisfying classification of the evolution of cinema. Perhaps it wasn't intended to, I'm not sure. I've never been comfortable with that idea anyway. But what it does do is gesture very effectively towards Deleuze's notion of the will to art itself, to creativity, and to the generation of images. The original will to art of the time image, for example, consists in extracting difference from repetition by reversing copies into the simulacra, to paraphrase Deleuze and various commentators. Art neither represents nor imitates, but it repeats. The whole idea of repetition is being replaced by representation is being replaced by repetition here. The way in which this works, and I'm going to skirt over this through the syntheses of time, there's no need to go over that, but what I want to move on to here is that I think this figure that I talked about, the dark precursor, the demon, reappears in a curious sense in the crystal image, which is the movement on from the movement image to time image, crystal image. And the crystal image, in some senses, emerges from the third passive synthesis of time, which, as Teretsky puts it, I'll just go over them very briefly. The first synthesis of time contracts successive independent elements of instance so that the present consists of their most condensed state. This synthesis constitutes a series of empirical presents by founding actual relations of succession, simultaneity, contiguity, resemblance, and causation between them. The second synthesis constitutes the whole of the past coexisting with each present by going beyond the empirical present to the a priori past. All differences coexist in the virtual past in varying levels of impression. But it's the third synthesis, in which we encounter the crystals of time, which enables the possibility of the future to arise from the conjunction and disjunction of living present and virtual pasts. And this is what he says about the third synthesis on the crystal. What constitutes the crystal image is the most fundamental operation of time, since the past is constituted not after the present, as it was, but at the same time. Time has to split itself in two at each moment as present and past. Or what amounts to the same thing, it has to split the present in two heterogeneous directions, one of which is launched towards the future, while the other falls into the past. Time consists of this split, and it is time, that we see in the crystal. The visionary, the seer, is the one who sees in the crystal, and what he sees is the gushing of time as divided into two, into splitting. And this split between two kinds of time is characterized elsewhere in Deleuze by reference to the Stoics as the distinction between chronos and aeon. On the one hand, there is the chronos, this being the perception that we have of an ineffable movement, into the future, what physicists refer to as time's arrow, a unidirectional momentum. On the other hand, we have what the Stoics refer to as aeon, a splitting of the present into the future and the past, a form of pure and empty and incorporeal time, which is made up of becomings without efficacy or actuality, events which coexist in both the past and the future. And Turetsky puts it, all events are simultaneous, since it encompasses all events in the crack between times. This is how aeon works. Aeon constantly decomposes ad infinitum. Its geometry is fractal, unfolding in a dimension greater than 0 but less than 1. It's Deleuze. The role of the image in this bifurcation is that of the simulacrum, an entity which, as he makes clear, has no fixed identity, may be contradictory or disguised, and belongs ultimately to a dimension in which an unlimited and illogical being is revealed. That being is, I would suggest, a space between frames through which the diabolical emerges. This demonic presence, this dark precursor, lives in those spaces between. It's about in-betweenness very much. Not only that, I'll just read the last bit. It is in this assemblage of forces on the plane of immanence that spirits in the transition from the movement image to the time image can be enabled to swarm into our world through images. Because what the transition affects in film is the collapse of framing, whereby time is represented indirectly, and the emergence of deframing regimes in which time is understood not as a form of chronological units or sequences, but as a force from outside. This is where he really moves towards in the crystal image and the time image. It's a force from outside. And this is what I would suggest is the demonic interjection. And I will conclude with a very short piece from H.P. Lovecraft, which is cited by Deleuze and Guattari, from a story called Through the Gates of the Silver Key. And the main character of which is a man called Randolph Carter, who has all kinds of adventures in these adjacent dimensions and universes full of horrible, blind, mutilated gods. And he says, now beyond the ultimate gateway, he realised in a moment of consuming fright that he was not one person's, but many persons. And this is what I'm suggesting, that this demonic, this dark precursor, this image of the diabolical, in Deleuzean terms, emerges as a multiplicity. And I will pause there because it's too dense to go on.